Eyes and ears up here, please. So we're going to talk about this healing of the man at the pool of Bethesda. We're going to begin by reading the entire story. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going, another steps down before me." Interesting answer. Don't you think that's an interesting answer? If you were sick or blind or crippled or whatever, and someone said, "Do you want to be healed?" what would your answer be? Mine would be, yeah, I do. But that's not what he says. He says, I can't get to the pool. I don't think some people say he's making an excuse. I think the problem is he doesn't know who Jesus is. I think he thinks this man is asking him, "Why aren't you getting to the pool? Don't you want to be healed? If you go to the pool, you'll get healed. Why don't you get into the pool?" I think he doesn't see who Jesus is. And so Jesus is about to show him who he is, just like all of John does. These were written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So Jesus said to him, "Get up and take your bed and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now, that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he said to them, which was a mat, it wasn't like this big old king-size mattress he was carrying around. But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father and making himself equal to God. So that's the story. Before we jump back into that story, the whole thing begins with the words "after this." John uses this term "after this" a number of times in John, and it generally indicates a gap of time. If it's the next day, he says the next day. If it's a couple days later, on the third day. But in this case, he just says some undetermined time after this. So we'll talk about what that is, but first I want to review a little bit of what we've studied so far, really quickly. So we talked about Christ cleansing the temple, about his meeting with Nicodemus, about his meeting with the woman of Samaria, his healing of the nobleman's son, and now let's talk about these gaps of after this. We can use, to a degree, we can use the synoptics. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record things that John does not. John records things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not. And so they can kind of fill in the gaps. The timing can be a little dicey at times, but these are some things that might have happened in the meantime, in that gap. I already talked about significance and the synoptics. So Jesus went from Cana to Nazareth, where he was not honored, where he was dismissed because they didn't believe that this carpenter could be anything. The son of Joseph could be the Son of God. And so even at one point, they took him to the edge of a hill and tried to throw him off to kill him, but they were unsuccessful because he just walked right through them. And I don't know what he did or what he said or if he was invisible. I don't know how he did it, but he just walked away. By the way, this is a hill outside of Nazareth. Maybe it was this hill that they tried to throw him off. Maybe not. You can't see Nazareth. It's behind the camera. And there's a large plain at the bottom of the hill. Anybody want to know what that, or does anybody know what that plain is? It's the plain of Megiddo. Anybody know what future event takes place on the plain?
Armageddon or whatever?
Armageddon. Armageddon. The final battle on earth will take place there. Now you want to go to Israel with me? Wouldn't that be cool to see? I mean, maybe not during the final battle, but you know, it would be cool. By the way, do people picture that battle as being this long, protracted battle between evil and good? No. It says two things. First, it says Jesus will come down from heaven on a horse, and he'll go, and they'll die. Apparently, there's fire coming from heaven too, just to, I don't know, seal the deal. I'm not sure, but it's going to be fast. Nobody can stand against God. It's not like they're going to fight God. They will be destroyed, and it will be those that have chosen to reject God and to be God's enemies. So this is Armageddon. This is the valley of Megiddo. So he leaves Nazareth and possibly went to Capernaum, which became his headquarters. He spent a lot of time at Peter's house there. We've talked about that before. And then finally he goes down to Jerusalem at some point. It says maybe he crossed the Sea of Galilee. We don't know, but that's pure conjecture. So let's talk about this healing. It takes place during a feast, not sure which one, and Christ reveals his deity at the feast. What is the purpose of John's Gospel? What is the thesis statement of God's Gospel? Of John's Gospel? Why did he write what he wrote? That we would believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That's why he wrote everything, including this. He reveals his deity. Now, the first thing we're told is that the place of the incident was near the sheep gate. Ancient Jerusalem had 12 gates that guarded the city and through which you walked to enter or leave the city. The certainty of all these gates is not known. In fact, the sheep gate isn't completely known. It might have been here, it might have been there. Either way, the pool was just outside the sheep gate, and indeed it is. Now, why was it called the sheep gate? It was the gate through which the lambs were herded on their way to the slaughter for Passover. And so that was the gate that was used to take them to the temple, which was, the Temple Mount was right there next to the sheep gate. Some scholars believe it is the same gate that the Lamb of God exited on his way to Golgotha, which at that point was outside the city gates, although it currently is inside the city of Jerusalem. The city is different now, obviously. We don't know exactly where Golgotha was. There are several options, but we don't know exactly where it was. So the pool was built there just outside the gate. It was built over a spring, and it had these columns with a covering to protect those who gathered there that were sick or blind or crippled. And it was called Bethesda. The name Bethesda means house of mercy, and you want to write that down. You want to be able to remember. Bethesda means house of mercy. This is where I tell you the Reader's Digest version of a Bethesda story. Not that Bethesda, but Bethesda Naval Hospital. My sister, I have 3 sisters, you know that. My next youngest sister, her name is Georgianne. Her name wasn't supposed to be Georgianne. Her name was supposed to be Jenny Rebecca. But something happened at her birth that changed that. When babies are born, this is still true, they give this thing called the APGAR test. They give it immediately, and then they give it, I think, 10 hours or a half hour later, something like that. A stands for appearance, P for pulse. I don't know what the GA, I can't remember what the GAR is, but they check the child, and they want it to be, babies are rarely 10s, but, because, you know, birth is a really traumatic experience for children. But anything below a 5 is really bad. My sister was born and was given a 2 on the APGAR, and even however long later they did the second one, she was, I think, still a 2. And in fact, they told my mother that she was going to die. And so my mother thought, well, I want to give my daughter something before she dies. And so she gave her her name, Georgianne. But she didn't die. And the doctors told my parents that she will live, we don't know how long. She had seizures intermittently. And they said she will never be normal. She is profoundly retarded. She's then mentally retarded. She'll never walk. She'll never go to school. But we can teach you how to take care of her, how to take care of her seizures. Georgianne was in the hospital longer than my mother was, and back then you were in the hospital for quite some time after giving birth. Now, women have babies and then just go home. It's like, why? You know, I realized that the only place I was a really good parent was in the hospital. Because once because I had all the help I needed, I had more help than I needed, right? But I took the baby home, and now I'm in charge, and I make mistakes. So I never left the hospital right away. Georgianne was at the hospital, but my parents were home. And I don't know how many days it was, but one morning my mother was at her prayer bench. She had a family heirloom prayer bench, which is now at Georgianne's home. And she was kneeling at that bench praying for Georgianne, and the phone rang. And my father answered the phone, and my mother heard him say, "You're kidding me, you're kidding me." And my mother said that as she was praying, she felt this light, this presence, like she'd never experienced before. And the doctor's words to my father were this: there's been a miracle in the night. Come pick up your perfectly healthy baby. And indeed, Georgianne is probably the most brilliant human being I know. She is so smart. Such a memory. She remembers stuff that I've never known. Just crazy. That took place, Georgianne was born at Bethesda Hospital, House of Mercy. And then when she was 3, she contracted either viral or bacterial meningitis, whichever one is worse. She had a 10-minute grand mal seizure that should have killed her. The doctor said she would never ride a bike, that she may be permanently, her brain may be permanently affected from the grand mal seizure and from the fever. And she recovered completely. She can ride a bike with ease. You would never know that that happened. That also took place at Bethesda Hospital. So this story and the name of this pool has particularly strong meaning for me. When God heals, He does it well. And that's what this man is just about to find out. Now today we can see the remains of the pool. I'm going to fly through this because you've seen these pictures, but you can see the remains of the pool. But as was often the case, churches were built over the spot because the Christians began to revere these different places where Jesus had been. And so they would build churches in honor of that. That was true of Peter's house as well. And so as those churches would be destroyed in war, then a new church would be built. At one time, St. Anne's Church there was being repaired, and they found this spring under the water. And they found this pool connected to the spring. And they knew that they'd found Bethesda because a faded carving on the wall, very ancient, was of an angel stirring the water. And so they knew they had found Bethesda. There is a nearby spring. It was also discovered. This is where you got down to the pool through these narrow steps, and here's the spring that fed the pool. And the story was told, or the belief was, that when the water was stirred, it was the angel. It was an angel who was stirring that water, and the first person to get down into the water would be healed. Or if someone got down the water while it was still being stirred, they would be healed. I mean, this, I think, shows their ignorance, because it obviously, the spring was stirring the water. And I don't know if anyone was ever healed in the spring. They just thought that would be true anyway. People believe all kinds of crazy things. But we can see the remains of the pool today, and memorials that mark the spot. So I want to talk now about the meaning of this incident. And this reveals who Jesus is, just as John wants it to. These are written that Jesus is the Christ, that you might know that Jesus is the Christ. And by believing these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So it reveals the grace and the mercy of God. It reveals Jesus for who he is. When the man says that he can't get to the pool on his own, Jesus doesn't rebuke him. Jesus doesn't say, "You idiot, there's no angel." He has compassion on him, and he reveals his deity. And in a sense, he's saying, you don't need an angel, you just need me. And Jesus heals him. So Jesus revealed who he is in the act, and John is telling us this. This is why John wrote his gospel. It reveals the deity of Christ. Why? Because only God can heal and only God can save. In fact, Jesus even provided the strength for the man to stand and walk. Ephesians 2:8-9 say, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourself." Even our faith is a gift from God. But here's where we see that Jesus gets himself. No, wait. Okay, we're going to come back to that. I want to say this first. So then Jesus gets himself in trouble, though, because this occurs during the Sabbath. And there was to be no work on the Sabbath, because God said, "Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy." And he said, "You shall do no work on the Sabbath." Now, I want to say a few things about that original law that was given to Moses. First of all, the Sabbath was Saturday. The Sabbath was the seventh day, is still the seventh day for Jews. Why do Christians celebrate the Sabbath on Sunday? Because that's the day of the week that Jesus resurrected. And pretty early on, they began celebrating that on Sunday. But for the Jews, it is Saturday. And they were to rest on Saturday. Why? Why did God command rest? First of all, he knew that we need rest. That if we don't rest, bad things happen. By the way, I tell you this because you're young, and it's not too late for you. One of the things I have read, because my sisters and I, with a father and a grandmother, that my father's mother, having Alzheimer's, having dementia, we're at higher risk. Do you want to know what the number one thing you can do to ward off dementia, to help you not get Alzheimer's? The best thing you can do? Get 6 hours of uninterrupted, at least 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep each night. I wish I would have known that a long time ago. I don't sleep well anyway. And I will live way less than 6 hours for a good portion of my life. But God knows we need rest. We need to rest. And so he commanded it. But that's not the only reason he commanded rest. What's often overlooked is that it was a command for all Jews. And so that rest command prevented Jewish employers or Jewish slave owners from overworking their people, their employees. It guaranteed rest for those who were poor and had to work for a living. They were guaranteed a day of rest. God was protecting people from other people. But here's the thing. Just like with other things, people took that good command of God and they added to it. And by Jesus' day, they even had categories of rest and hundreds of laws that were never intended, that were never written by God to say, if you do this, then you're breaking the Sabbath. It was man that was saying that those things were breaking the Sabbath, not God. For example, if you were a tailor, you couldn't wear a needle in your collar because that would be work. If you weren't, you could. You couldn't wear a nailed shoe because what if you lost a nail? You would have to hammer another one in. That would be work. So you could only wear a sewn shoe or a shoe that was all of one piece. You could only walk so far. It was called a Sabbath day walk. So I think it was a mile or two, but no farther, or you were breaking the Sabbath. And Jesus tells them, I'm not breaking the Sabbath. Is it unlawful to do